Hello, everybody. Corinne Smith here, coming to you from behind the slides so that you can give your full attention to these 12 myths and misconceptions about Henry David Thoreau. Let's just jump right in. Number 12, he merely imitated his mentor, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson, of course, was a former Boston minister who had moved to Henry Thoreau's hometown of Concord, Massachusetts, and who had become a very popular essayist and well-traveled lecturer. He wrote the essay Nature that started the Transcendental movement, and it brought to Concord such like-minded people as Ellery Channing, Bronson Alcott, Margaret Fuller, and others. Writers like these, like other creative artists, could benefit from being around other writers, and they could inspire one another. The idea that Thoreau and these other Emerson followers were merely imitating him came initially in print from poet, critic, and editor James Russell Lowell. In 1848, Lowell published a lengthy satirical poem called A Fable for Critics, in which he pretty much dissed every living writer in the Northeast. By this time, Henry Thoreau had gotten some poems and essays published, but he had yet to release any books. Still, Lowell took this opportunity to make some pseudo-anonymous jabs at Henry and at his best friend Ellery Channing. Lowell wrote, "There comes Thoreau, for instance, to see him's rare sport, tread in Emerson's tracks with legs painfully short. How he jumps, how he strains, and gets red in the face to keep step with the mystagogue's natural pace. He follows as close as a stick to a rocket, his fingers exploring the prophet's each pocket. Fie for shame, brother bard, with good fruit of your own. Can't you let neighbor Emerson's orchards alone? Besides, 'tis no use, you'll not find e'en a core. Channing's picked up all the windfalls before. They might strip every tree, and never would catch him. His Hesperides have no rude dragon to watch him. When they send him a dishful and ask him to try 'em, he never suspects how the sly rogues came by 'em. He wonders why 'tis there are none such his trees on, and thinks 'em the best he has tasted this season." A couplet with visual rhymes there, and they were kind of clunky, Mr. Lowell. But obviously, he's using the fruit metaphor to apply to the poetry of all three men. Whether it's relevant or not, you can decide. It's possible, too, that since Emerson and Thoreau were from the same area, they may have had similar ways of speaking, especially to people from other places. When Henry once traveled to Philadelphia to give a lecture, he met a friend of Emerson's, William Henry Furness. Furness later wrote back to Emerson and said, "I was glad to see Mr. Thoreau. He was full of interesting talk for the little while that we saw him, and it was amusing to hear your intonations." Huh, yeah, so maybe the two men sounded alike. Emerson may have started transcendentalism, but I don't think he ever spent as much time fully practicing it as Henry did. I like to say that Emerson wrote it and Thoreau lived it. Thoreau's writings, his observations about both nature and mankind, his focus on details, all of them are his own, based on his opinions and his abilities as a creative writer. Anytime you set out to follow in somebody else's footsteps, the journey eventually becomes yours. It has to. So, no. Number 11, he invented raisin bread. Now, in the economy chapter of Walden, Thoreau spends more than a full page describing his bread making successes and failures, and he does not mention raisins at all. But on the first page of the Brute Neighbors chapter, he writes, "I have water from the spring and a loaf of brown bread on the shelf." Brown bread was known at the time to contain both molasses and raisins. And by now, several generations of cooks had already been experimenting with tossing dried grapes into bread dough. Still, and oddly enough, in 1943, a curious item appeared in the September issue of the Ladies' Home Journal. The regular monthly feature compiled by Ann Batchelor called Line a Day included this quick anniversary listing for September 2nd. It was over 100 years ago that Thoreau, the one-time nature hound, left the trees and brooks long enough to invent raisin bread. now, now, there are several mistakes in this seemingly simple sentence. First of all, Thoreau moved away from Walden Pond on September 2nd, 1847. This magazine was from 1943, so it wasn't over 100 years ago. It was only 96 years. That's a math error. Describing him as a one-time nature hound is kind of nutty too, and could even be seen as a borderline insult. I mean, if you thought he was a nature hound, wasn't he one for his entire life and not just part of the time? And then the coup de grace, he left the pond specifically to invent raisin bread? What? How? What really happened is that Thoreau moved into the Emerson house in order to take care of the family while Waldo was traveling for a lecture tour. And the Emersons usually had a cook working for them. Would Henry have even been allowed into that kitchen? When would he have invented raisin bread after he left Walden? Nevertheless, this 1943 column was discovered by members of the newly founded Thoreau Society, who at the time were eagerly scouring libraries and the media for any mention of their hero. Founder and secretary Walter Harding made a quick reference to it in a 1951 Thoreau Society bulletin newsletter, and he thought enough of it to include the Ladies' Home Journal citation on page 183 of his 1962 book, The Days of Henry Thoreau, which is still considered to be one of the good standard biographies. But Harding later recanted the connection between Henry and raisin bread more than 20 years later. After all, there was no proof, and other people had made raisin bread before Henry had. So, no. Number 10, he stole pies from windowsills. Now, we don't know where this rumor came from, and I think the people who make this claim do it merely to poke fun at Thoreau or to show somehow that he really wasn't the person we think he was. But as I just mentioned, while he lived at Walden, he used his stove to cook his own meals and to make his own bread. Yes, he walked back regularly to his family's home about a mile away by following the tracks of the Fitchburg Railroad, and since his mother often took in boarders, she was probably good at baking pies. And her daughters Helen and Sophia and their young in-house maid could have been good at baking them too. And if a pie were cooling on their own windowsill, it's not a stretch to think that Henry could swipe a slice or two to carry back with him to Walden. But a whole pie? Why? And how? How would he have carried it? How would he have gotten away with that? So frankly, no. Number 9, he was lazy, or he was a crank, or he was standoffish, or he had no compassion, or he had no sense of humor, or any number of other negative assessments of a guy who, let's face it, has been gone for more than 150 years. Some of his major detractors have even felt the need to publish books and publish articles on the subject. My first reaction is, can we just stop overanalyzing this guy? Let's just accept the fact that on a sliding scale of introversion and extroversion, Thoreau slid toward introversion. And by the way, if you want to learn more about introverts, be sure to read Susan Cain's terrific book, Quiet: The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. She mentions Henry Thoreau just once, but you'll recognize him in other parts of the book. And maybe you'll see yourself here too. Back to Thoreau. He tells us enough about himself that his inclinations are clear. In the first chapter of Walden, he says, I would rather sit on a pumpkin and have it all to myself than to be crowded on a velvet cushion. Isn't that great? That's kind of showing his humor there too. In the chapter called Solitude, aptly enough, he says, I feel it wholesome to be alone the greater part of the time. To be in company, even with the best, is soon wearisome, and dissipating. I love to be alone. I never found the companion that was so companionable as solitude. So he reveals himself to us regularly. I mean, isn't the whole point of the book that it's okay and it's personally validating to spend time alone, to get to know yourself and your surroundings and how you fit into them, and to learn what interests you the most? And then when you're satisfied with your discoveries, you can feel free to step back into society again. Isn't this part of what compels us to appreciate the book and to prompt some of us to do something similar with our own lives? If Henry Thoreau had been a social butterfly in the life of any party and had made no time to study nature and to document his observations, would we even be talking about him now? Of course not. We needed him to be the person that he was, and in his own time, in his own place. Think of other naturalists whose works you may have read, people like John Burroughs, Rachel Carson, Annie Dillard, Aldo Leopold, John Muir, Sigurd Olson, and May Sarton, just to name a few. Sure, some of them were more social than others, but all of them are people who are comfortable enough to get out and experience and observe nature on their own. And fortunately for us, they were also willing to share their findings in writing. We need people like them, and we are better off because of them. As for Henry Thoreau's sense of humor, I offer you one of my favorite passages from his journal, the entry from September 16th, 1859. Grasshoppers have been very abundant in dry fields for 2 or 3 weeks. Sophia walked through the depot field a fortnight ago, and when she got home, picked 50 or 60 from her skirts, for she wore hoops and crinoline. Would not this be a good way to clear a field of them? To send a bevy of fashionably dressed ladies across a field and leave them to clean their skirts when they get home. See, that's Henry, always thinking, and really a funny guy, a funny guy. So let's accept Henry David Thoreau for who he was and who he is. Please stop overanalyzing somebody who has been gone a good long while, whom none of us can ever meet in person again, and who, yet, still lives deeply in many of our hearts. Oh, except that I still have 8 more points to make here. Number 8, he didn't believe in God. Now, the key here is not to confuse belief in God with participation in the rites of an organized religion. Like most early New England towns, Concord, Massachusetts had at its center a big white church building. Early on, the church was Congregational. Later, it became Unitarian. Most of the Thoreau family members attended First Parish Church, as it was called and as it is still called, and Henry was baptized here. But once he could think wisely for himself, he chose not to go to the services anymore. He could often be seen instead walking through the nearby woods or wading through swamps on Sunday mornings. At the time when there was just one main church in town, traditionally, every adult resident was assumed to be a member, and every member was therefore expected to pay an annual fee to go toward the minister's salary. Thoreau got such a bill when he was in his early 20s, and he took the time to write to the town clerk in response, saying, "Sir, I do not wish to be considered a member of the First Parish in this town." As a result, he never got another bill to contribute to the salary of the First Parish minister. Of course, 5.5 years later, he would challenge another automatic tax. We'll get to that one in a few minutes. Thoreau did write about the church. You can find lengthy examples of his thoughts in the Sunday chapter of A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers and in the Montreal chapter of A Yankee in Canada. And you can find references to God and to religion scattered throughout his books, essays, poems, and journal entries. But of course, Thoreau was a transcendentalist. which meant that he preferred to find the Spirit of God within himself and by going out into nature instead of sitting in a church pew listening to interpretation offered by somebody else. He was not a religious churchgoer, but he was spiritual. So, yes to God. To organized religion? No. Number 7, he once wrote, "Go confidently in the direction of your dreams. Live the life you've imagined." You can find this quote all over the place, online, on posters, on mugs. The trouble is, it's just a paraphrase and a summary. What Thoreau really wrote in the conclusion chapter of Walden is this: I learned this, at least by my experiment, that if one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams and endeavors to live the life which he has imagined, he will meet with a success unexpected in common hours. Great advice, great quote in its full form. And this is just one of the many examples that Thoreau has been misquoted in. We like to say that he could be the most quoted and least read American author. Unfortunately, a lot of the quotes you see or hear are just outright wrong. Fortunately, though, the Thoreau Institute at Walden Woods has a webpage listing the most egregious of these errors. It's called the Henry D. Thoreau Misquotation page, and you can find it at www.walden.org. I'll put the link in the summary below. So, go confidently. Sure, yes, it can be a great and noble and courageous act, but don't claim that Thoreau said it this way, because he didn't. Number 6, he went to Walden Pond to write the book Walden. Oh, if it were only that easy. As a budding writer, one of the reasons that Thoreau moved to the shore of Walden Pond in 1845 was to write a book about the river trip that he had made with his brother John in 1839. John had tragically died of lockjaw tetanus 3 years earlier in Henry's arms. So Henry wanted to write a tribute book, and he also needed to get out of the bustling Thoreau household in order to find his natural creative writer's voice. In hindsight, this self-imposed writer's retreat was a success of sorts. A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers was published in 1849. Not to a great response, which is a story for another time, but at least he got it out there. At the same time, people were asking him what it was like to live at Walden, and he had already begun assembling pieces for a second book as a way of explanation. He gave more than a dozen public lectures to test out his material on audiences, and finally on August 9th, 1854, Walden, or Life in the Woods, was published by Ticknor and Fields of Boston. This book had better sales. Thoreau was able to see all 2,000 copies sold before he died in 1862, and he had already made arrangements for Ticknor and Fields to sell a second edition after he was gone and to shorten the title to simply Walden. The book has not been out of print since. It has been issued in hundreds of editions in many languages, and it has been made an impression on many readers over the years, perhaps even some of you who are watching right now. Please note, too, that this book is titled either Walden or Life in the Woods or simply Walden. Please call it one or the other. It is decidedly not called On Walden Pond. It was not made into or based on a 1981 movie featuring Henry Fonda and Katharine Hepburn, which was written by New Hampshire playwright Ernest Thompson and was filmed at Squam Lake and Lake Winnipesaukee. Don't make me add a 13th item to this list. The bottom line is that Thoreau went to Walden to write a week. So, no. Number 5, he took his laundry home to his mother. Once again, we don't know how this rumor started, and once again, it's usually made by somebody as a boast to show that Thoreau was not the person we think he was. Let's be clear here. Thoreau was not a survivalist. He didn't move to Walden to cut himself off permanently from the rest of the world, even though he did spend time there in his own small house. He went to Walden to think and to write and to figure out his own version of the meanings of his life. I mean, he tells us why in the second chapter of Walden. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. Yes, he regularly walked back to the village to see his family and friends along the Fitchburg Railroad tracks. And once again, surely his mother or their in-house maid would have done the laundry for the whole household because they often took in boarders and had other people living there. Doing laundry was a task that was in the woman's sphere at the time, and they had the devices and soaps and such they used for washing clothes back at the house. Thoreau, living out on Emerson's land at the pond, did not have that option. And why would he rinse his clothes in the same water that he swam in and bathed in? Maybe he even did some of that. We don't know. And why does no one ever ask who did Mr. Emerson's laundry, or Mr. Hawthorne's, or any other notable American author over the years? Why does the subject of Thoreau's laundry matter to anyone? Why doesn't it even come up? Let's think of this question in another way. How many clothes would Thoreau have really owned or worn? He didn't have enough clothes while he lived in his Walden house to warrant building a closet or getting a dresser. When Thoreau traveled to Mount Monadnock in New Hampshire in 1860, he took these pieces of clothing for a 5-day trip of hiking and camping. On the left-hand column there. One shirt, one pair of socks, 2 pocket handkerchiefs, 1 thick waistcoat, 1 flannel shirt he didn't use, an India rubber coat for rain, 3 bosoms, which are garments that cover the chest when you're wearing a vest. And that's it. He was wearing his pants. He was wearing his drawers underneath, presumably. But that was it for a 5-day trip of hiking and camping. Almost a year later, when he planned a 3-month trip to go all the way out to Minnesota and back, here's what he took: a half-thick coat, a vest called a waistcoat, a thin coat, best pants because he was wearing his traveling pants, flannel shirt, 3 shirts, 5 to 6 bosoms, 3 pairs of socks, 1 pair of drawers, a smoke cap, slippers, 2 neckerchiefs. He eventually wrote home, sent the smoke cap home, asked for another pair or 2 of drawers. And that was it for 3 months on the road. Since Thoreau was basically wearing the same clothes almost every day, wouldn't it have been a good idea for somebody to wash them every once in a while? So while Henry was living at Walden, did he take his few pieces of laundry home to his mother? Or more likely, did he give them to their in-house maid to wash? Probably, as any young man in his late 20s would have done back in the 1840s, no matter who he was or where he was living. And who knows, maybe Thoreau did this once a week, or once a month, or once a season. He was wearing the same thing over and over. Would his laundry have filled a whole basket? No. Number 4. During the night he spent in the county jail, he was visited by Emerson, who asked, "Henry, what are you doing in there?" To which Henry replied, "Waldo, what are you doing out there?" It's a great story, isn't it? Shows perfectly well the differences between the 2 men. And a lot of us probably heard a version of this exchange from our English teachers in high school, or by reading The Night Thoreau Spent in Jail, the anti-war play that was written by Jerome Lawrence and Robert E. Lee in 1970. It is still being read in paperback and is still being performed by both students and adults today. But where did Lawrence and Lee get the story? Turns out it's been around for more than 130 years, and we're still not entirely sure that it's true. Let's start first with the basics. On a July day in 1846, Thoreau was living at Walden. One day he walked back to Concord Center to conduct some personal business, and in town he was met by Sheriff Sam Staples, who confronted and arrested him, politely, mind you, for non-payment of taxes. The tax in question was the state poll tax, P-O-L-L. Every man of voting age in Massachusetts was then required to pay an annual tax of $1.50 in order to be able to vote in state elections. By the way, this kind of poll tax is now illegal, of course, but it wasn't back then. Henry Thoreau had decided that he never intended to participate in elections. So why should he pay a tax to do something that he wasn't ever going to do? Made perfect sense to him. Besides, the state could use that money instead to fund either the new war with Mexico or the return of fugitive slaves to their owners. Even more reason not to pay it. Well, Sam Staples reluctantly locked up Thoreau with one of the other prisoners. Now, Concord was a county seat for Middlesex County, and the county jail stood right behind the Middlesex Hotel, which you can see here on the right-hand side of the engraving. The hotel was 3 stories high. The jail was 4 stories high, built of granite, and it had iron bars on the windows. Evidently, word got out that Thoreau was in jail. Overnight, somebody, a shadowy figure, came to the Staples residence and paid the tax. It was probably Henry's Aunt Maria, who lived just across the town center from the jail in what is now the complex for Concord's Colonial Inn. Sam Staples released Henry Thoreau the next morning. Thoreau was inspired to write an essay that we now call Civil Disobedience, where he spent about 8 paragraphs describing his jail experience, and when he published Walden 5 years later, he included an additional but brief description in about half a paragraph of the village chapter. And for the next 35 years, those passages supplied the world with the only details that Thoreau himself revealed about his jail experience. We didn't know this story yet. It would take diligent intervention and research for someone to uncover it. And this diligent intervention and research came in the late 1880s when 2 avid Thoreau fans from 2 different places found one another and began to correspond. Samuel A. Jones of Ann Arbor, Michigan, and Henry S. Salt of London, England. Both were admirers and biographers of Thoreau, and they wanted to nail down with accuracy as many details from his life as they possibly could. To do this, they tracked down people who were still alive, who had known Henry Thoreau during his lifetime, decades earlier. And one of the individuals they found was Eben Jenks Loomis. Loomis was a scientist who worked for the Nautical Almanac Office of the United States Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C. But he had married a Concord woman named Mary Alden Wilder, and they had lived in Concord for a while. They had even lived in the Thoreau boarding house, and the Wilders were family friends with Thoreau's maiden aunts. Loomis had gone on walks with Henry Thoreau. It was Eben Jenks Loomis who told Jones and Salt about the conversation in the jail in 1846. He said that his source was Thoreau's Aunt Maria, who often repeated the story in exactly the same way. Now, Loomis was a man of science and precision, but it had been 40 years since he first heard this tale. Was he remembering it correctly? And had Aunt Maria been telling the truth to begin with? Or had she made the whole thing up? Hard to tell. And even though Sheriff Sam Staples was still alive, and even though he flat out denied letting Emerson into the jail that night to see Thoreau, this story was too good for the diehard fans to pass over. Samuel Jones and Henry Salt loved it. Salt repeated it in 1890 in the introduction to an edition he put together of 5 of Thoreau's essays, as well as into a standalone Thoreau biography. Well, that opened the door for other Thoreau biographers to repeat it, of course. Annie Russell Marble, Leon Basselgett, Henry Seido Canby, Joseph Wood Crutch, Charles R. Anderson, and others. They all wrote it in their books because it really is a fun and memorable story, obviously. By the time Lawrence and Lee wrote their play, the jail door exchange between Thoreau and Emerson had become practically legendary. But the playwrights must have known that its validity was still questionable. After all, Sam Staples had said that Emerson did not come into the jail for a visit that night, and scholars aren't sure Emerson was even in Concord that day. So at the end of Act 1, in the night Thoreau spent in jail, you'll see that Emerson asks his question from outside Thoreau's barred window and not from inside the jail. The question remains, did this exchange ever happen? A number of scholars and fans don't think so. What could have happened instead is that when the two men next met, Emerson could have asked, Henry, why did you go to jail? Thoreau could have replied, Waldo, why did you not? But would this have happened inside the jail itself? Probably not. And now I feel I should interrupt this countdown to share a tangential tidbit of information, and it's a pretty darn juicy one for fans of Emily Dickinson. I just mentioned Eben Jenks Loomis as a Thoreau friend a few minutes ago. His name may have struck a chord with you Dickinsonians because he and his wife Mary had just one child, a daughter, Mabel Loomis Todd. Mabel was Emily Dickinson's neighbor, her first editor, and well, let's just say she had a lot of connections with the Dickinson family and with Emily's legacy. And this is a complex story to be told on another day by somebody else. But I thought you might like to know. Now, back to our own Thoreau countdown. Number 3. As a result of spending that one night in jail, he wrote an essay titled Civil Disobedience. In a word, no. After Thoreau left the jail, people started asking him questions about why he took the stand he did, and so he began to think about and to write about his political opinions and his brief experience. In 1848, he gave 2 lectures on the topic in Concord under the titles Relation of Individual to State and Rights and Duties of Individual. His eventual written essay appeared in the 1849 issue of Aesthetic Papers with the title Resistance to Civil Government, and that's how it was known during his lifetime. But in 1846, 4 years after Henry was gone, his publisher Ticknor and Fields worked with his sister Sophia and his friend Ellery Channing to produce a compilation of essays called A Yankee in Canada with anti-slavery and reform papers. One of the reform papers showed up with the new title, Civil Disobedience. Who called it that? Certainly not Henry. If you look through the essay, you'll see that he never uses that phrase. He uses the word civil only 3 times when he's not quoting somebody else, and he uses the word disobedience twice, but he never puts the 2 words together. So who did? I'm assuming that someone at Ticknor and Fields decided to up the ante and to call it that. After all, disobedience and resistance are 2 very different approaches to challenging authority. I suspect the person who coined the phrase never did either one. Someone made Henry David Thoreau the poster child for the concept of civil disobedience, and he didn't even call it this. I doubt that Sophia or Ellery would have come up with that combination of words, and Thoreau never thought highly of any editor who changed his words without his permission. Still, 1866 was the moment when the change was made. Even the marker installed at the old site of the Middlesex County Jail promotes the wrong title. So, did Henry technically write an essay called Civil disobedience? No. This is his lasting reputation, but no. Number 2, his name was pronounced Thoreau, with the accent on the last syllable, the way I've been saying it here all along. Well, no, technically, I've been saying it wrong this whole time. Written evidence shows that back when he was alive, Henry and his family members pronounced their surname with the accent on the first syllable, like thorough, like you're doing a thorough job. And that's the way his friends wrote the name down. Friends like Bronson Alcott, who wrote this entry in his journal on May 3rd, 1839. Evening, met a circle of persons at Mrs. Thoreau's for conversation. And their topic was futurity. How about that? At Mrs. Thoreau's. Or what about this from Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote this wonderful description in American Notebooks? Mr. Thoreau is a keen and delicate observer of nature, a genuine observer, which I suspect is almost as rare a character as even an original poet. And nature, in return for his love, seems to adopt him as her especial child and shows him secrets which few others are allowed to witness. That's nice. Isn't that nice? And how about Thoreau's friend Daniel Ricketson, who lived down in New Bedford, Massachusetts, which is south of Concord? He once included this original poem with one of his letters to Henry, a poem which ends with the lines, "My heart is beating strongly to see your face once more, so leave the land of Thor and row along our shore." These men knew Henry personally. They knew how to say his name. If you look up Henry Thoreau in a standard dictionary today, you'll probably find two pronunciations listed. The first one, seemingly the more accurate one, is thorough, with the accent on the first syllable. The second example is the one that many of us have fallen into, the one that's grown more popular, and that's Thoreau, with the accent on the second syllable. I don't know about you, but my excuse is that this is the way my English teacher said it to me back in 1973, and I've been saying it wrong ever since. It's a real challenge for me to correct my mouth by now. Even if you too can't stop yourself from saying it wrong, you should at least know the right way to say the guy's name. It's Thoreau. It's not Thoreau. Leads us to number 1. He was a hermit. Because, after all, he spent 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days living in a 10 by 15-foot house just like this one, didn't he? Well, not continuously. He walked back to the village on a regular basis. There was that one night he spent in the Middlesex County Jail. And in August 1846, Thoreau made a 12-day trip to Maine that he would eventually write about. So no, he didn't isolate himself for good. We already know that introverts can be as social as they want to be or as they choose to be. To earn the lingering title of hermit, Henry really has only himself to blame. Let's go back to the Brute Neighbors chapter of Walden. It begins with a dialogue between two characters, one called Hermit and the other called Poet. How much more obvious can you be? We assume that Henry is the hermit and that his friend Ellery is the poet. Thoreau even throws an inside joke here by making a reference to the barking of Bose. Bose was the name of Ellery's dog. And so this is probably fictitious banter between the two friends as the poet comes out to the pond to see what the pond dweller is doing. And Henry Thoreau knew the English language well. He often played to the true or multiple definitions of words. So let's go to the definitions. A hermit is a person who lives by himself in a lonely or secluded spot, often from religious motives. Well, transcendentalism was sort of a religion. It also suggests as a synonym recluse. Let's look up recluse. Shut away from the world, secluded, solitary. So recluse is the more limiting and slightly more negative word, really, of the two. When we hear someone called Thoreau a hermit today, they may be doing it with a negative tone, as though being a hermit is a bad thing. In this case, what they may be implying instead is that he was a recluse, which we can prove was not the case. So, technically then, was Thoreau a hermit while he lived at Walden? Sure. Was he a recluse? No. And there you have it, friends, explanations for 12 myths and misconceptions about Henry David Thoreau. If all of this talk has prompted you to want to read what Henry wrote, here are some basic suggestions. You've got Walden, of course, as a whole book. Sometimes that can be difficult to get into, especially with the long first chapter of economy. Perhaps easier would be the essay Walking, which comes in a standalone book sometimes, and it's a wonderful essay to start with. You can get a compilation volume of the essays of Henry David Thoreau, and they usually include civil disobedience, and they usually call it that. You may be inspired to move on to his major travel books like Cape Cod or Maine Woods. You might want to go back to read his first book, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, the book he went to Walden to write. All of these books have been released in various formats by various publishers over the years, so yours may not look like these. And if you want to learn more about Thoreau's life, I recommend reading at least one of these standard biographies by Laura Dossel Walls, Robert D. Richardson, and Walter Harding. All were written at different times with different perspectives and different access to information. All are worthwhile to read. And so we wrap up this video about Henry David Thoreau. Feel free to post comments and questions below. You can also subscribe to this channel and ring the bell to get instant notifications. Thanks again for joining me. This is Corinne Smith, signing off for now.